and you're here participating in our system and coming out to hear somebody running for Congress is all great. Thank you so much.
In a South Carolina district that stretches along the coast, goes through Charleston, and continues south past Hilton Head, there's a candidate running for Congress who is pouring his heart into what many people consider a doomed campaign.
My name is Michael B. Moore, and I think I'll start at the very beginning.
Michael B. Moore is a candidate for Congress in South Carolina's 1st congressional district. He's a businessman who's running in a pretty Republican seat as a Democrat.
That is Patrick Marley. He writes about voting issues for the Post. And he followed Michael B. Moore in the days leading up to South Carolina's Democratic primary.
One of the campaign events I attended was at Gullah Grub. It's a Sea Island restaurant known for its gumbo. There, he made a pitch to voters, about 50 of them.
We all have origin stories, right? These stories that sort of ground us to the past, but they're so powerful and profound for us that they have a way of propelling us into the future.
And he started that pitch by talking about the incredible story of his great-great-grandfather, Robert Smalls.
Robert Smalls, my great-great-grandfather, gets a lot of the airtime around here.
Robert Smalls is a Civil War hero. He was someone who was born into slavery, who escaped slavery by commandeering a Confederate ship, got to the Union, eventually piloted ships for the Union, and then after the Civil War, he served 5 terms in Congress. Michael B. Moore takes that story as an inspiring one and says that he hopes to follow in his great-great-grandfather's footsteps.
I had a really profound opportunity to be running for the same seat in Congress that my great-great-grandfather served 150 years ago this year.
He hopes to follow in those footsteps, but to do that, he's got to win a district that is pretty difficult for Democrats to prevail in. He's attempting to do that by talking about a lot of core Democratic issues like curbing gun violence, making green energy more available, ensuring people have access to abortion, which is restricted in South Carolina. But he's also talking about something that you don't hear a lot about in campaigns, and that is ending gerrymandering.
Ending gerrymandering. Moore won his state's Democratic primary. But no matter how hard he tries, it is unlikely that he'll win the general election. And that's because of something the Supreme Court decided back in May about gerrymandering, something that made it easier for Moore's competitor, Republican Nancy Mace, to win the seat.
The Supreme Court let stand a gerrymandered district that will make it extremely difficult for Michael B. Moore or any Democrat to win this district. And it's the latest in a line of decisions that have made it harder to challenge those maps and have preordained results in many races so that the lawmakers who draw the lines get to decide who gets sent to Congress, essentially, rather than the voters deciding who gets sent to Congress.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Thursday, September 5th. Today, we head to South Carolina's 1st congressional district. Patrick takes us into a race that some people are writing off as already decided. And at its center is a Supreme Court decision with far-reaching consequences for American democracy. But first, the origin story of Michael B. Moore. So Patrick, tell me a little bit more about Michael and specifically about his family history.
So Michael B. Moore, he's a businessman. He worked with Coca-Cola. He ran a food company. He's worked in tech. But one of the things he draws on a lot in his campaign are his family roots in South Carolina. His great-great-grandfather was Robert Smalls, who has a quite fascinating history during the Civil War.
In some corners, Robert Smalls is called general because of his military experience. Others he's called congressman. I grew up hearing about grandpa, hearing about the man. And
Robert Smalls was born into slavery. He was a slave when the Civil War was underway, and he worked on a Confederate ship. And he and other enslaved people got their families onto the ship and commandeered it overnight and took off out of the harbor in Charleston, past all these Confederate forts, and then out into open water. I mean, this was risked all of their lives. If this mission had failed, they surely would have been killed. And, Michael B. Moore never would have been born.
Look, he was an enslaved person. He had no reasonable, rational right to think that he could be free. But yet he allowed himself to think about it and then to pull together a plan and to execute it.
And then Robert Smalls goes on to pilot ships for the Union during the Civil War. After the Civil War, he becomes a member of the state legislature and then eventually becomes a member of Congress and serves 5 terms in Congress.
I have to say for the record that this should absolutely be turned into a movie, because I would 100% watch this heist on a boat leaving South Carolina with enslaved people who it's an incredible story.
It is you wouldn't believe it if it were presented to you as fiction. This story can't be believed. It is a stunning tale. So Robert Smalls was elected to Congress for the first time in 1874. This is just the black population was much higher in South Carolina then. It was 60% of the state was black. So he's elected in 1874, but within years, white lawmakers started to push back and they engaged in gerrymandering. By 1882, they had pushed most of the black population into one district. It curbed their power and made it much harder for black members of the state to become elected to Congress. That seat ended up being held for a little more time into the 1890s. But after that, nearly a century passed before voters in South Carolina elected a black person to Congress. That was when Jim Clyburn was elected in 1992.
Wow. So this is an incredible family history that Michael B. Moore has. How does that affect him? What does it mean to him to know all about the actions of his great-great-grandfather and to have this story as part of his story?
Well, he talks about it a lot on the campaign trail, and he says that it is part of what inspired him to run, that he's, as he puts it, he's building on the struggles of his ancestors. And he says, look, I've got challenges in this race. These lines were drawn in a way that will make it very difficult for me to win. But he says, I think back to what my great-great-grandfather thought.
Certainly the odds were even greater for him to do all the things that he did in his life than things that I've tried. I've lived a very comfortable, privileged life. And so, I think just that having the confidence knowing that I come from people who have achieved great things is meaningful.
It would be difficult to even imagine undertaking the kind of things that Robert Smalls did. And he says if he could overcome that kind of adversity, then I've got a shot, that I've got to, take on the big challenges and dream big for moments like this, because he overcame so much more than I could.
And then tell me more about Congresswoman Nancy Mace, who is Moore's opponent in the general election.
Yeah, so she won her seat, this district, in 2020, and kind of profile originally as sort of a more moderate Republican, as someone who said the Republican Party needed to put forward different policies when it came to things like abortion.
I represent a swing district, and the vast majority of the people that I represent on either side of the aisle were not happy after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And I'm a pro-life member of Congress. I have many exceptions, but I'm willing to meet in the middle and find some common ground.
But as this district line was changed and the district became far more Republican, she has shifted to the right. She was instrumental in unseating Kevin McCarthy as Speaker with the other group of further right Republicans who joined with Democrats to do that. And now that the lines are cemented in the way that they are, she should have an easy path. Cook Political Report, for instance, rates this as a solidly Republican district because of the way that the Supreme Court said that the lines could be set for this district.
After the break, we get into how the lines were drawn, why the Supreme Court allowed this gerrymandering, and what it could mean for our democracy. We'll be right back. So, Patrick, I would love to hear more about how we got here. Like how Michael B. Moore and Nancy Mace's district has changed and why it seems like this year the result of their race is essentially already decided. But first, I think it would be helpful for us to have a common definition going forward for gerrymandering, which, you keep using that word, but it's a term that we throw around and I think can be a little bit confusing.
So gerrymandering is just manipulating lines to benefit some group of people. There are different types of gerrymandering. There's partisan gerrymandering. That's where you draw the lines to benefit the Democrats or to benefit the Republicans. And there's racial gerrymandering. That's where you draw the lines to include one racial group or keep a racial group out or keep, Hispanics or black voters or white voters to a particular percentage within a district. And the Supreme Court essentially allows partisan gerrymandering, or at least says federal courts can't get involved in partisan gerrymandering, but does not allow racial gerrymandering. The challenge is that often they look like the same thing, and it can be hard to determine which one you have on your hands. This is important because when gerrymandering occurs, more and more congressional races are taken off the table. So fewer and fewer races actually matter. And control of Congress comes down to just a handful of districts that will determine whether Republicans or Democrats control that House. And most voters don't get to have a meaningful election every 2 years.
So then thinking about this district in which Michael B. Moore is running, how did South Carolina end up in this position where its, once competitive district has become not competitive? Like, what's the story and the events that led up to this change?
So it's good to go back a couple of election cycles to understand this better. In 2018, Joe Cunningham was a Democrat, and he won the district, a district that had been thought to be solidly Republican. He won it by a very narrow margin, 50.7%, something like that. And so he held that district, he held it for one term, and then Nancy Mace came in 2020, and she wins the district, also by similar numbers. A little over 50% is what gets her into the seat.
So it seems at that point that there's a healthy sense of competition here, that there's a Democrat and then there's a Republican, that there's a sort of fight back and forth for who this district is going to go for in Congress.
It's as competitive as you get. It's, everybody's got to go all out, run great campaigns, get their voters out. It could go either way. It's a district that can flip. But in 2020, the census comes out, and every state, every 10 years, based on the census, has to do redistricting. They have to change where their lines are for Congress and for state legislatures to ensure that they have equal populations, right? If you have, every district has to have the same number of people in it. Otherwise, you don't have one person, one vote anymore, right? If one district has 500,000 and another has 1 million people, you sort of got more power with your vote in the less populous district. So every state has to draw new lines. State legislature, which is controlled by Republicans, draw new lines that shore up the first congressional district, Nancy Mace's district, and make sure that it's solidly Republican and goes from being competitive to one that can easily be won. And that's evidenced by how Nancy Mace does in 2022, when she is an incumbent, so she does have that advantage. But she wins in 2022 with 56.5% of the vote.
And what did that tell people?
Well, that tells voters that the district is no longer competitive. I mean, that tells people who study elections that, this district has gone from a competitive one to one that can very easily be won by a Republican, and that is, a very stiff challenge for a Democrat.
So then how does this become an issue that goes before the Supreme Court?
So after the lines are drawn, a black voter and the South Carolina NAACP, represented by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, sue in federal court saying that this is a racial gerrymander, that the state lawmakers deliberately used race to decide where to draw the lines. And the NAACP argued that it was an unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. They put it before a 3-judge panel that agreed with the NAACP, and then the state appealed and took it to the Supreme Court.
And what was their evidence in making that claim? Or like on what basis did they make the argument that the way that their district map had changed was unconstitutional?
So Nancy Mace's district had grown in population, and an adjoining district had lost population. So voters needed to be moved, tens of thousands of voters needed to be moved out of the Mace's district and into other districts to balance the populations. But lawmakers initially brought in more voters into Nancy Mace's district and then shifted out a different set of voters. And that's where you saw these dramatic changes in Charleston, where 30,000 black voters got moved into a neighboring district. Black voters who sued said that was a deliberate effort to draw along racial lines. And at trial, they were able to turn up evidence that showed that when the staff for lawmakers drew the lines, they had real-time data showing the racial makeup of the district, and they could track, as they moved a line 1 block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks, what the percentage of black voters and white voters would be in the district. This was important information because black voters are so closely aligned with the Democratic Party in South Carolina that if you get over a certain threshold, it tips the district from Republican into competitive territory. And so they said that they very deliberately kept the number of black voters in the district at about 17%, which was a number they knew would allow them to make it strongly Republican.
Well, let me just pause here and ask. I mean, do we know that that was a result of redistricting? And not that maybe Nancy Mace ran a better race than her challenger in the 2022 general election, or that just the will of folks in that district changed between 2020 and 2022? Like, does a win of 56.5% really mean that a district is no longer competitive?
That's the root of all of these gerrymandering cases, is that the question is, what is fair? How do you define fairness? It's easy to find something as unfair. It's a lot harder to say, well, okay, what is the fair resolution of that? And it's also difficult for people to take their partisan blinders off. Like when their party benefits, they tend to think everything's fine here. And when the same situation happens in another state in the other direction, they think it's terrible. As one person I put it to me, look, South Carolina is a red state. There's no getting around that. Donald Trump won in 2020 with 55% of the vote. But he didn't win by such a margin that it tracks with the makeup of the congressional delegation. But is it so lopsided that the state has 6 Republican members of the House and 1 Democratic member of the House? Well, it's a 55% Republican state. Is it really so lopsided that there's no seat that's competitive, that's a toss-up?
Interesting. So what you're saying is that, yes, South Carolina is red, but it's only like 55% Republican. And yet 6 out of the 7 members of Congress are Republicans. That's like, 85, 86% of the delegation is Republican.
Yeah, and I mean, it's important to know that, underscoring what a red state it is, the question is not, should this be a Democratic district or a Republican district? It's, should it be a Republican district or a competitive district? Under competitive lines, we know Nancy Mace can win. She won in 2020 when the lines were tough and she just, barely got in. So the question is not red versus blue, it's red versus competitive.
And, you alluded to this before, but how did it go at the Supreme Court? Like, what did the justices say about the map?
So this federal panel of judges takes testimony, holds a trial of longer than a week, gets a lot of documents, and reaches the determination that it was a racial gerrymander, that there was a bleaching of the district, that there was a deliberate effort to keep it to a certain number of black voters, and that violates the Constitution, and that new lines for the district need to be drawn. Before any lines are drawn, the state appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court. It takes a while for the case to go up there. In the meantime, the 2022 election is held under the lines the legislature had drawn, and then this case was decided here this year right before the 2024 election.
What was the decision?
Supreme Court said there wasn't adequate evidence that state lawmakers had drawn this for racial purposes, but rather that they had drawn them for partisan purposes, which it allows to happen.
I'm curious, how did that decision break down between the justices? And do we have any sense of why the majority came to that decision?
Well, the court followed the ideological lines that you hear a lot about. It's a court with a 6-3 conservative majority, and that's exactly how they ruled. There were not a lot of surprises in this case. And essentially what they said was you needed to have smoking gun evidence of a racial gerrymander in order to throw out a map. So the Supreme Court in this case set a very high bar for the type of evidence that you have to have. It's almost as if you have to have someone coming right out and saying, we drew these maps because we were concerned about the number of people of a certain race in the district. And that almost never happens. People are not openly saying when they engage in racial gerrymandering. So it makes it very hard to prove now.
So what does that mean for the communities where this map has gone into place?
Well, the real impact is in the Charleston area, because that's where you saw the gerrymander happen. The north side of Charleston got carved up and part of it put into another district. So voters there, particularly black voters, feel like their voice has been muted or diminished in some way, that they can't get the attention of their member of Congress as easily as other communities can, because they're sort of split between these two districts.
What did the folks that you talked to on the campaign trail tell you about how they were feeling about what happened?
You know, as a reporter, I'm always a little tentative when I bring up gerrymandering, because it is such an arcane subject, and I feel like voters won't know the ins and outs of it, which is, not a thing normal people pay close attention to. And I was surprised at these events for Michael Moore at how readily people were aware of what had happened and the strong feelings they had about it. So they knew what had happened. They were angry and frustrated about the Supreme Court decision. I was struck by how common it was for them to strike a tone of, well, I expected this to happen. This is nothing new. American history is rich with things like this. That's what people like the Reverend Kenneth Hodges told me.
Well, we know that nothing is new under the sun. Some of the same challenges that Robert Small faced towards the end of Reconstruction, we are experiencing them again.
And yet, they say, we maintain hope. They sort of look beyond this particular race and, they're hopeful that they can win, but they say, even if we don't, we feel that eventually we'll get to a place of greater equality.
Because we are also people of faith, but we are determined people. We will live to fight another day, but we keep on fighting.
Reverend Hodges told me that, but others did too, like Anita Singleton Prather.
We made it through the Middle Passage Court. We made it on the auction block when our family members were. We made it at the whipping post. We made it to the lynching tree. We made it to Jim Crow. And we'll make it to gerrymandering.
Patrick, I'm curious what you make of all this. Like, what you learned in South Carolina that can potentially be applied to the rest of the country in this election cycle.
Yeah, I think the thing that's important to keep in mind is that this ruling resonates far beyond South Carolina. This is just one congressional seat that this particular case was about. But what the Supreme Court did was it set a new standard that makes it much, much harder, nearly impossible, to successfully make a racial gerrymandering claim in federal court. And it empowers those who draw the lines, which in most cases are state lawmakers. And that means in Democratic states, they'll draw lines that benefit Democrats, which can shape the makeup of Congress. And in Republican states, they'll draw the lines for Republicans. And in swing states, they'll draw the lines in a way that benefit whoever happens to be in power at the moment.
And to be clear, this isn't just South Carolina that's trying to challenge some of this. I mean, we're seeing this play out in states around the country, right?
Yeah, there's always litigation after redistricting, and it lingers. Here we are 4 years after the last census, and you're still seeing litigation.
The Supreme Court is allowing a Louisiana congressional map to be redrawn to add another majority black district. State officials were sued last year for a congressional map passed by the Republican legislature that made
You'll continue to see it through the decade up until the next round of redistricting.
One of 7 districts, congressional districts in Alabama, was predominantly black. Only one.
There's a new court decision today on alleged gerrymandering by Democratic lawmakers in New York State. A panel of appellate judges.
So coming back to this congressional candidate, Michael B. Moore, what does he make of this? And what is his reaction to the fact that he is facing an uphill battle in a district that, some have argued was intentionally designed to prevent him from being able to be elected?
So he's a very upbeat guy, and he disparages this ruling.
If the overall overriding objective is to respect one person, one vote, then manipulating political districts to concentrate power and to therefore limit political power seems to be at cross purposes with one person, one vote.
But he says, don't count me out. I see a path here. I think that we can bridge the divides, and this district is still winnable, even if the math looks terrible for me.
In general, I talk about, that I'm uniquely qualified in this race to pull together the kind of broad and deep coalition that we need to win. That's, getting all these voters of color, getting women, getting young people, and then also attracting, good amounts of independents and moderate Republicans. So we're doing all those things.
So he's, at least publicly, putting forth a brave face and saying this is doable. But the deck is stacked against him. It would be quite a surprise if he were able to win. But, we've seen surprises in politics before.
Patrick, thank you so much for sharing this story with me.
Thank you for having me on.
Patrick Marley reports on voting issues for The Post. Before you head out today, let's check in on the Paris Paralympics. Right now, China is at the top of the medal count. The U.S. is in third, behind Great Britain. One sport that we on the audio team have been very excited about covering is a sport that is all about sound. This is goalball. In goalball, athletes rely entirely on sound and touch to help them throw and roll the ball to the opposing team's goal. The sport was created for players who are blind or have low vision, originally as a way to rehabilitate military veterans who had lost their sight.
So a lot of people aren't used to seeing things like that, or they don't know about it. It's a niche sport.
That is Trayshawn Faison. He made it onto Team USA for the first time this year.
A lot of people call it the coolest sport you never heard of.
Reporter Amanda Morris caught up with the U.S. men's goalball team at a practice game last week.
You're literally using your body as a shield. Yeah. It's not like you're trying to avoid getting hit. You're trying to get hit, basically.
People call it like reverse dodgeball, right? You don't want that ball to get past you. You want to put yourself in harm's way at times and get in front of a 40-mile-per-hour ball that's made of hard rubber flying at you.
In goalball, all players wear masks that totally obscure their vision. They use taped-down strings to feel for the lines on the court. And the ball they use has bells in it that jingle with movement. Faison says a big part of the game is mental.
Each individual court has this different sound, right? So like in here, it's hard to hear. There's a loud AC, but in the venue, it's going to be hard to hear because there's a lot of people, right? A lot of crowd, a lot of ambient noise. So you have to really get focused, too. Like, it actually helps a lot with the auditory part, too, just focusing on the bells and the ball.
Team USA did not make it to the medal podium this year. They placed 6th after losing to Iran. The final happened today, and Japan took the gold. Still, Faison and his teammates are hoping that more coverage of the games this year will bring new fans to goalball.
Once you start watching it and you understand the nuances, you'll fall in love with the sport.
That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you want to show your support for the show, please subscribe to The Washington Post. It is a great way to help us continue to do the kind of work that we do on this show. Everything from deep political reporting to dispatches from the Paralympics. And now you can get access to Washington Post podcasts ad-free in Apple Podcasts. Subscribe in Apple Podcasts or by following the link in our show notes. Today's show was produced by Rennie Svirnovsky with help from Emma Talkoff. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Rena Flores. Thank you to Griff Whitty and also Amanda Morris, who is reporting from the Paralympics in Paris. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.